Hey everybody, it's Adam back again with yet another tutorial from the Army Painter. Today we're going to be exploring the new characters that we developed for a new product line that we are going to be releasing in the next few months called Gamemaster. Today we're going to be painting up Zherxik, a male Tiefling Wizard. He's often safe in the background, conjuring theatrical spells in the air. He likes to dish out the hurt and is often reckless in his pursuit of inflicting the maximum amount of pain to his enemies, putting his friends at risk in the process. Today we're going to be expanding on the Adventure Ready tutorial that we previously released by applying some highlights and reestablishing some of the base tones, slightly more advanced techniques that are really going to pay off in the end. So let's take a look at the paints that we're going to be needing for today's tutorial. So now that you have your paints, go ahead and get yourself some clean rinsing water, a wet palette, I sure like to use mine, and your favorite brush, and let's get started. All right, for the first part of the level up tutorial, I'm just gonna apply a little bit of Fire New Orange to my palette, and I'm going to begin basing in, or I should say re-establishing and highlighting the glowing yellow eyes on the model first. Just very carefully with the Fire New Orange, I'm just going to find the center of the eyes. I'm just going to reestablish the eyes there with that bright yellow color to add to this glowing yellow eye effect. Now with Succubus Red, we're going to go back and reestablish the skin tones. And I love this color for the skin tone on this model because it is kind of a pinkish, a rosy red as opposed to the brighter reds that we're using on the trim of the cloak. It's going to cause some nice variance to the model. And with this highlight, we're just finding all of the highlights and raised areas, and we're re-establishing the base tone that we previously completed in our Adventure Ready tutorial. We're leaving some of the wash in the recesses to keep that balance of contrast, depth, and shading on the model. So we're just reestablishing some of these highlights, like here on the tops of the hands. Very thin down paint, thin the paints with clean water. All of the D&D Nolzur's Marvelous Pigment paints are 100% water-based, so they thin with clean water, and they're safe for the environment. They carry the Nordic Swan eco label. So repeat this all over the model, like here on the tail. Again, we're leaving the wash. You can see how the wash is settled into the recesses here. We're just going to leave it in the recesses and pick out the highlights, reestablish that base tone of Succubus Red. This is just going to help to make the model pop just a little bit more on the tabletop. We're essentially, if we dump down the contrast, push the contrast on the model by applying the wash in our Adventure Ready tutorial. Right now, we are tuning up the vibrance and saturation on the model. Now that we finished applying the highlights to skin tone, we're going to go back and base in and reestablish the highlights on that purplish black gray cape that we did. Now we did this in the last tutorial with about a 50-50 mix of Abyssal Black and Farazer's Purple. So I'm using some of the same paint, the same mixture of paint that I had still sitting nice and wet and workable on my wet palette. And I'm just going to re-establish some of these highlights, bring it back up to that nice gray tone that we had before. Again, this is just going to help to make the model pop just that little extra bit more on the tabletop when you're playing in your dungeon adventure with your dungeon mates. So very carefully leaving some of that wash in the recesses. We're just filling in these middle areas on the model with that purple and black mix. This is legitimately coloring within the lines because we want to leave, you can see here we have that wash settled nice and cleanly, nice and dark in the recess. We want to leave that there, and we're just bringing back up that purplish gray tone in the center. We're going to repeat this all along the cape, the cloak here, and next we'll come back to this gray cape and the hair on the model. All right, now that we've gone ahead and highlighted all of the purplish black cloth on the model, we're going to go with the more standard gray, including the boots here. So we're just going to start again with that 50-50 mix that we used to base coat the model in the previous tutorial. And we're going to pick out the ridges and the raised areas, leaving that wash, that shadow wash in the recesses. This is just reestablishing that base tone, reinforcing it, and helping to make those colors pop. We're really pushing the contrast on the model in this step. It's very simple. We're coloring in between the lines being the shadows and shading that the wash provided us. Like here on the cape, you can see that we still have some of that darker tonality in the center. So we're just going to take some of that gray mix and we're going to reestablish the highlight. We're using very thin down paint. We're going to work in layers here. Let this first coat dry, and then you'll go back and apply a second one just to reestablish that gray tone. So very carefully take your time, reestablish those highlights, and go ahead and leave that wash, leave the darker tones in the recesses. As you can see here, on areas like here on the hood of the cape, you can kind of use the side of your brush, call this an edge highlight. It's kind of like a hybrid edge highlight to just reestablish and pick out those raised areas. Same here on the side of the cape. Just use that side of the brush and drag that grayish black paint down the recesses. On areas like the hair, we are going to have to trace in these bits. So just very carefully find the raised areas and pick them out with your paintbrush. Add the striations to the hair. And we'll do this across all of the gray areas on the model. If you think that it needs a second coat, like here, just go ahead and apply that second coat, ensuring to leave that wash in the recesses. Now we're going back to our cobalt red, and we're going to just reestablish this brownish red inner shirt on the model. Again, we're just picking out the highlights, finding the raised areas, leaving the wash in the recesses. Very simple here, using very thin down paint. So I have ultimate control of the paint on the brush and just picking out those highlights in order to reestablish the base tone and really push the contrast and vibrancy on this model. Follow the same steps with rigid leather this time on all of the leather and brown areas on the model, like this pouch here. Our little potion holder, potion canteen. And of course the stave. Now you see I'm just taking the brush and right now I'm tracing in this color on these spiral design that's etched into the stave, the handle of the stave, while I'm leaving the wash in the recesses. On areas here where you can see this is carved out of like maybe a log, I'm gonna pull this highlight almost like a wood grain down the edge, leaving the wash in the recess here to really pull off that grainy wood effect on the stave. Very carefully, we're going to take some skeleton bone, just add a very simple highlight to the rope that's keeping our potion pouch attached. And while we're at it, we're going to take some of that skeleton bone, some of the orc skin and underdark gray, and we're just going to reestablish the stone pavers on the base. This time very, very careful to leave the wash in the recesses. We're just going to pick out those colors and reestablish the stone pavers on this cobblestone base. I got the underdark gray, and we're going to reestablish those pavers. It's very simple. Nothing too difficult here, just reestablishing those highlights. One coat should be fine. If you do want to have it a little bit more pronounced, you can add a second coat, but one coat should be fine just to get to the effect that we're looking for here. Very simply, just one coat, like so. It's really been an exciting process developing these characters for this new product line called Gamemaster. Now, everybody at HQ had their hand in developing all of these characters that we're using to help narrate the storyline of our new product line, but we also hired John Gallagher, world-renowned artist, to help us with some of the box art. So let's take a look at what he has to say about our Tiefling Wizard.
But anyway, the interesting thing, of course, is you want to capture the arrogance of that particular kind of mindset as best you can. And normally you do that through, you know, a proud, handsome face and a great horn display. And if you get that, you get tieflings. I mean, the gear, they tend to have a little bit of a broader range of eclectic garment, pardon me, or eclectic armor and garb and ornament. It tends to be a little bit more, ornamental and perhaps a little less functional, maybe heading towards the dandy or the heightened fashionista of the D&D world. They can tend to be a little bit of, you know, they can be coxcombs and a bit foppish. So you try to throw a little bit of that in there, but they're also, you have a reputation for being neat and orderly in particular and fussy. So you got to kind of try and balance that out a bit. And I took a couple of different looks for Mr. Ekrai, but ended up with what I think is kind of a classic defining profile. And he does like to hang to the back, so you know that's where he is, dishing it out with not a lot of concern whether he's going to hit anybody or anything.
So I've already begun highlighting up all of the red trim on the model. This is going to be the last step before we go ahead and begin highlighting up the metallics, which will be the last step in this tutorial. Now I'm taking Cambion Crimson here, and just very carefully with very thin down paints, I'm finding the raised areas and the folds, and I'm allowing the wash to kind of sit in the recesses. So I'm just picking out the most extreme areas in the folds, areas like here at the bottom, and I'm applying this in coats. So I'm going to apply one because red paint does tend to be a little bit weaker of a pigment. So you want to be patient and careful not to apply too much too thickly. And if you apply it in just 2 coats as opposed to 1 thick coat, 2 thin coats, you're going to get a much better effect, and you're actually going to get more simple blending at the end of the day because you are applying it in thin layers, almost like a glaze as opposed to just base coating the model. So very carefully picking out the raised areas, the sharpest edges with this Cambion Crimson. We're going to repeat this all around the model. Some areas that you want to pay attention to, like here on the folds. Now we already based in the internal, like the black and purple cape, so this gives us a good idea of where the folds and where the light's going to catch the red trim. You just kind of follow that along. You take it to one side of the fold, and that's where the light is going to reflect off of the trim of the cape. On areas like here, you can see that the sleeve is a bit darkened down, and the wash will do that. While it does create great depth and contrast, it will darken down the base tone just a bit. So most of what we're doing in this tutorial, in the level up tutorial, is just rebuilding those base coats, redefining them, reestablishing them, so that the model really jumps as a nice saturated application of color on the tabletop. So repeat these steps across all of the bright red trim on the model, and then we'll move on to painting in and highlighting the metallics. Now on to the final step in this tutorial. I've got some Dwarf Bronze and Mithril Silver on my wet palette, and I'm just going to re-establish the metallic areas on the model. Like this little piece of jewelry here, I'm just taking some Dwarf Bronze, and I'm picking out the most raised areas. Again, with every other step in this tutorial, you've heard me say this a bunch. You're probably getting sick of hearing me say it, but that's what this level up tutorial is all about. You're just finding the raised areas on the model and re-establishing those base tones. This is our initial highlight on the model. If you're new to painting, the highlighting step is definitely a more advanced step. It's not necessary to put your models on the table, but it's just a little bit of extra time that'll really help the model stand out and really impress your gaming friends when you get to your next dungeon party. You can already see that it helps to make those metallic areas really stand out, makes them a lot brighter than after we had applied the wash, because we are just reestablishing some of those bright pigments in those metallic paints. Once we're done with Dwarf Bronze, we are going to move on to Mithril Silver. We're going to apply the same techniques to all of the silver bits on the model, like the rings and these little rings around the stave. And for the head of the stave, I'm just going to block in the flat panels, leaving some of these creases in the recesses. It looks like this was carved out of metal, a gift maybe to our sorcerer here. So I'm just going to pick out those areas, leaving some of that wash in the recesses. On the top areas where we've got some of this, I'm just going to lightly scrape, almost like dry brush, pulling a dry brush across the edge, leaving some of that recess on the flatter areas. It's just adding some texture to this metal stave, metal portion of the stave. You don't want to forget this little buckle here on our pouch. Just give it a little line, a little trace of that silver, and of course, our ring here. He has his arm stretched out almost as if to say, kiss the ring. I hope you enjoyed this level up tutorial as much as I enjoyed painting up this Zherxik model for you today. Remember that you can find all of the paints and the products that we use today at your friendly local game store from your favorite online provider such as Amazon or at www.thearmypainter.com. Remember that the magic in miniature painting is that it can be as simple or as challenging as you'd like it to be, but with the right techniques, you're sure to achieve some great results. We'll see you next time.